Welcome to Cool Talk and back to the presidential series. Harry S. Truman, president number 33. Truman was an unassuming man who had the bad luck of following the great FDR to the White House. He was very unpopular, but today everybody loves Harry now that he's dead. Just kidding. Anyway, Truman was born in 1884 in Lamar, Missouri, but he grew up in Independence. He loved school. He read all the books in the library, said all the teachers were wonderful. He was so smart that he skipped the third grade. He took piano lessons as a child. He was very, very disciplined. And while he was a child, he met a little girl named Bess Wallace, a bit of a tomboy. She would grow up to be his future wife. Truman grew up and he held several jobs. He kept in touch with Bess Wallace, wrote her letters, even proposed marriage to her as a young man. She turned him down, but they stayed friends, and this was a big thing with Truman. Friendship. He built a big network of friends. He invested in a couple of businesses and failed, but then World War I broke out. When the war broke out, he joined, and it was hard for him to join. He was so nearsighted he couldn't pass the eye test, but he found a way to cheat his way through, and he joined. He was 33 years old, and they put him in charge of a big band of Irishmen, and he fought, and Truman saw a lot of action. Now, after the war, Truman almost joined the Ku Klux Klan, but when he heard that they hated Catholics, and many of Truman's friends were the same Irish Catholic men who fought with him in World War I, well, he turned his back on the Klan. Later, as president, he would push for civil rights for blacks and desegregated the troops. He looked up Bess Wallace again and proposed, and this time she said yes, they got married. Then Truman turned to a good friend. It was Tom Pendergrass. He was a Kansas City political boss who persuaded Truman to get into politics, and Truman became a county judge, Jackson County. Now, Truman gained a reputation for his integrity, and he was convinced by Pendergrast to become a senator. So he ran, he campaigned hard, and he won. Interesting, he had a hard time making friends in the Senate, but the few that he did make, he remembered. And Franklin D. Roosevelt would slowly come to respect this honest man from Missouri. By this point, World War II had broken out, and Franklin D. Roosevelt did not forget this Missouri senator. When Franklin D. Roosevelt decided to run for his fourth term, he decided to choose Harry S. Truman to be his vice presidential candidate, and they won. Now here is a funny story. Vice President Truman had very little to do, but one day he visited the press club in Washington and decided to entertain the crowd by playing the piano. Now the movie star Lauren Bacall was there. She sat on top of the piano, bringing about this photo, which many felt was unbecoming of a vice president. Now, Bess Truman, his wife, was furious and told him he couldn't play the piano in public anymore. Now, Lauren Bacall kept working well into her 80s, and you younger people might remember her from this episode of The Sopranos. She died just a couple of years ago. A few months later, President Franklin D. Roosevelt died, and Vice President Truman became the new president. He gave his condolences to the widow, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, and asked if he could do something for her. She said no. What can we do for you? You're the one in trouble now. And it was a difficult time. The war was winding down in Europe, but it was still fierce in the Pacific. Now, Truman did know about the Manhattan Project. And the Manhattan Project, what was it? Well, it was a group of scientists who had succeeded in creating an atomic bomb. Billions were spent, but the project was very hush-hush. Only a small circle of people knew about it. Truman met with Prime Minister Churchill of England and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union to discuss a post-war Europe. In one of these discussions, he mentioned the big secret, the atomic bomb, what it was, and how it was successfully tried and tested in the New Mexico desert. Stalin was casual and he recommended using it on the Japanese, but the truth was that Stalin already knew about the bomb. His spy network was so vast. Now the war in Europe ended, and came the big question, how to end the war in Japan? Do we use the atomic bomb or not? Truman was preparing Operation Downfall. It would be a series of invasions of Japanese islands. He got the recommendations of President Herbert Hoover, among other experts, and asked them, how many American men would die to end this war. The report said it would take at least a year, and the number of dead would be between 500,000 to 1 million troops. So, Truman stalled, negotiated, gave Japan a stern warning to surrender or face destruction. Japan didn't, so Truman gave the order. August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and 3 days later on Nagasaki. Over 200,000 Japanese died. Half of them died on the first day. The very next day, Japan surrendered and the war was over. The surrender took place on the battleship the USS Missouri, presided over by General Douglas MacArthur, who said the famous words that the world had been given its last chance. Another world war would bring about Armageddon. So the war was over, but believe it or not, for President Truman at least, now came the hard part. He approved the new charter of the United Nations and used it as president, and especially in helping create the new state of Israel and an Arab state out of what was once British Palestine. Israel became a state in May 14, 1948, and the United States was the first country to recognize it as a nation. Not everybody was pleased. Since Hitler was now gone, Stalin decided to extend his power over Europe. Winston Churchill said that an iron curtain had descended across Europe. When communist rebels, backed by the Soviets, tried to take over in Greece and Turkey, Truman sent millions of dollars to help fight off the rebels and introduce the Truman Doctrine. Truman appointed General Marshall to head the Marshall Plan, pouring billions of dollars into Europe, helping the reconstruction of what Winston Churchill said was a rubble heap. As long as Europe could rebuild, it could stay out of communist way. And Stalin said the United States was merely buying its way into European hearts, and he refused the help of the American dollars. Now, Germany had been split among the Allies, and so was Berlin, split in two, the east part deep into the Russian sector, and the west part, of course, with the rest of the Allies. Now, Stalin ordered traffic going to West Berlin to stop going, hoping that the lack of food arriving in West Berlin would persuade that part of the city to join East Berlin and fall under the Russian power structure. So, what did Truman do? He sent planes to drop food and supplies over West Berlin. 270,000 airlifts in just 11 months. With all this, you might think that tough little Harry became popular, but no. In fact, many of his own party wanted another candidate to run for president in 1948. Why? Well, he was pushing for civil rights. Surprisingly, since he almost joined the Ku Klux Klan, but he desegregated the armed forces. He was successful in that, but he couldn't pass an anti-lynching law. There was no federal law against lynching, and it was 1948. Can you believe that? Lynching laws were gradually established from state to state, but to Truman's credit, we have to say that there was not a huge outcry for these reforms. So he thought it was a moral duty to stick to his guns and push forward. It was around this time that Jackie Robinson became the first black baseball player in the Major League Baseball. He pushed for a higher minimum wage. He wanted to extend Social Security. He wanted to improve housing and implement a national health insurance. He had a hard time doing any of this since the opposing Republican Party dominated Congress, and after 16 years of the Democrats in the White House, many felt the need for a change. Well, in the elections, enter Republican candidate Thomas Dewey. People were so sure that popular Thomas Dewey would win that newspapers had already declared Dewey a winner in the headlines. But when Truman won the election, he held up one of these newspapers and smiled. During the Truman years, antibiotics became widely available. It's a Wonderful Life made its debut. TV programs came out like the Howdy Doody Show and the Ed Sullivan Show. They made their mark. The Kinsey Report ushers in the sexual revolution. L. Ron Hubbard, founder of Scientology, publishes Dianetics. It was a time of Charlie Brown and the publishing of The Catcher in the Rye. After a long civil war, communists took over China, and many Americans blamed Truman as if he could have stopped it. And when the Soviet Union successfully tested an atomic bomb, Red Scare paranoia gripped the world. Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy hunted down presumed communists, often ruining innocent lives in the process. Even if you weren't a communist, if McCarthy suspected that you had a communist friend, he wanted you to name them. Famous Helen Keller was targeted just for having radical friends. If you had a radical friends or radical views or worked with a radical or dated a radical, you were a target. McCarthy went after Hollywood big time. Burgess Meredith, Lucille Ball, Zero Mostel, Edward G. Robinson, Richard Attenborough, Orson Welles, and Dolores Del Rio, who was targeted for dating Orson Welles. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover wanted to deport Charlie Chaplin so badly that Chaplin did him a favor and moved to Switzerland, only coming back once to pick up an honorary Oscar in 1972. At this time, Americans Julius Rosenberg and his wife Ethel were convicted of spying for the Soviets and giving away secrets about the atomic bomb. Now, Julius was a spy, but speculation is that his wife Ethel was not. She was convicted on the dubious testimony of some who may have been protecting themselves. Did she know? We can't say. They were executed for treason in 1953. June 1950, communist forces from North Korea invade South Korea, and the United Nations formed a coalition. But principally, it was the United States that sent in most troops to push them back. Truman put General MacArthur in charge, and his troops pushed the North Koreans back. But then China got involved, and its troops pushed back against the coalition. General MacArthur, without consulting the president, spoke to the press and stated that the United States would carry out the war in China and drop an atomic bomb on the Chinese people. Truman was outraged and fired the general for overstepping his authority. Now, firing that war hero got Truman more hate mail than dropping the Hiroshima bomb ever did. The Korean War lasted about 3 years, and in the end, everything ended up in a stalemate. North Korea was pushed out of South Korea, the United Nations coalition was pushed out of North Korea, and China was pushed out as well. A demilitarized zone was established between both countries, and it is still there today. Dozens of countries participated, but the countries with the most casualties were North Korea, with 250,000 dead, South Korea, 137,000 dead, China, 152,000 dead, and the United States, with 36,000 dead. After World War II, well, everybody was happy. The troops came home, but there was a shortage of jobs. Then there was the baby boom, which took place. There were not enough homes to accommodate so many families, so house prices skyrocketed. There were union strikes, and Truman would send in troops to fill in jobs at the railroads and other places. It was a very bad and hard time for Truman. He wasn't catching a break. There was even talk of impeachment. And at the end of his term, Truman was exhausted. He decided not to run for president again. Now, Truman supported Democratic candidate Adlai Stevenson for the Democratic ticket in 1952, but after 20 years, the people were tired of the Democrats in the White House, and they elected five-star General Dwight D. Eisenhower instead. When Truman left office, his approval rating was 23%, the lowest in the history of presidential popularity polls, lower even than Richard Nixon. And when Truman retired, he didn't capitalize on his presidency. In fact, he didn't even have much money. Congress did establish a presidential pension shortly afterwards, and he did benefit from this, along with writing his memoirs, which brought in some badly needed income. Truman was content that he had done right and believed that history would vindicate him. It did. And today, Harry S. Truman is considered a near-great president by American historians and scholars. He died in 1972. He was 88 years old. Well, send me your comments. This is Cool Talk.